Welcome. Thank you for joining us for this presentation. My name is Anesdra Garland, and I will be your moderator for the presentation, The Cage of Oppression. Okay. This presentation is interactive, so throughout the presentation, we will be asking questions, and then at that time, as you know, after we ask the questions, we'll give you guys opportunity to either post your answers in the chat box, or you can raise your hand and allow me the opportunity to unmute you, so that way you can, share or ask your questions out loud as well. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and give it over to you, Cinnamon, so you can go ahead and get started.
All right. Thank you, Anesdra. Hey, everyone. Thank you all for joining us on this webinar. So this webinar is entitled Cage of Oppression, and my name is Cinnamon Porter, and I'm a prevention educator for YWCA McLean County and their Stepping Stones program. And my pronouns are she and they. And so this webinar around Cage of Oppression will be looking at how the US society is organized around human difference, and we're going to be using a macro lens. And during the presentation, we will define certain terms like privilege, oppression. We'll touch on different forms of oppression, so those isms like racism or sexism. And in addition, we will examine our personal relationship with the cage of oppression. And we will discuss how this cage is supported, how it still exists, and ultimately what we can do to break free from this cage of oppression. Like Anesdra noted, this presentation will be interactive. So if you all have questions, please post them in the chat box, or you can also raise your hand, and then Anesdra can unmute you. I'll also have times where I will ask for feedback or ask for your input. So I would really appreciate you all chiming into our conversation. So let's go ahead and get started.
Before you continue, Cinnamon, I just want to say, if you guys feel comfortable, go ahead and turn your cameras on so we could see everyone's beautiful face throughout this as we interact, if you feel comfortable with that. And then also, if everyone could introduce themselves in the chat box. So just tell us your name and tell us what you do. We would appreciate that as well.
Thank you. And then what I'll do is I will share my screen so that you all can see the presentation here. So give me one moment to share the screen. All right, can you all see the presentation? Should say YWCA is on a mission.
Yep.
Awesome. All right, so let's go ahead and get started here. So again, my name is Cinnamon Porter. My pronouns are she and they, and I'm a prevention educator for Stepping Stones. And today we're going to be talking about the cage of oppression. What we're going to start with is defining some terms that folks commonly use when we talk about privilege and when we talk about oppression. So the first term that we will start with is the word stereotype. I imagine a lot of you all have heard that word before, stereotype. So let's talk about what it means. A stereotype is a reduced or simplified characteristic that is attributed to a group of people. So throughout these definitions, I'm going to use the same example and keep building on that. So an example of a stereotype would be all poor people are lazy. Okay, so we're reducing a group of people, poor people, to one characteristic, that all poor people are lazy. Now, we know that that's not true, right? Most poor folks work not just one job, but 2, 3 jobs on top of taking care of their household, family members, things like that, okay? And in this sake, a stereotype is harmful when we reduce all poor people to being lazy. You could use a stereotype almost in a positive way. And an example of that would be all football players are tough. When people play football, it's important to be tough. So in that sense, if all football players are tough, that could be seen as a positive thing. But here, when we're talking about stereotypes, we're talking about a negative stereotype. So again, our example being all poor people are lazy. Let's go to our next definition. So a prejudice. Another term that is often used interchangeably with stereotypes and some of the definitions that we'll give later. But a prejudice is a prejudgment based on missing information or stereotypes about a specific group of people, and that could be either a social group or a cultural group. So a prejudice is an attitude, an opinion, or a feeling that is usually formed without personal experience. So when we think about a prejudice, it is a stereotype plus a value. So continuing on with our example of all poor people are lazy, that was our stereotype. Our prejudice will be all poor people are lazy, and so I think less of them, and that's the value. I think less of poor people. And if I think less of poor people, that means that I think more highly of and more favorably of wealthy people, okay? So now what we're doing is we are separating these two groups of people and putting them into categories of who is better, who is worth, who do I value more versus who do I value less. So stereotype, all poor people are lazy. The prejudice is all poor people are lazy, therefore I think less of them. And let's build onto that one more time and talk about discrimination. So a discrimination is a behavior based on a prejudice. A discrimination is a showing of prejudice in treatment. It could be specific policies or actions that are directed against the welfare of a group of people. So to sum that all up, discrimination equals prejudice plus action, and action would be the key word there. Again, using our example, I think less of poor people, right? Using our prejudice, I think less of poor people. Therefore, I do not invite my poor friends to social gatherings where my rich friends will be. So the action is not inviting my poor friends and keeping them separated from my rich friends. And that is an intentional action. So what we're doing is treating people differently, making an action based off of a person's social or cultural group. And we have one last building block. So we're gonna take discrimination and we're gonna make one more building block, and that would be oppression. So oppression is a system of structured inequality where the goods, services, rewards, privileges, and benefits of a society are available to some individuals and not others according to their presumed membership in a socially identified group. So I'll take a quick pause there, let y'all reread that, and I can reread it as well. There's a lot of words there. So oppression is a system of structured inequality, and system and structured are keywords, where the goods, services, rewards, privileges, and benefits of a society are available to some individuals and not others according to their presumed membership in a socially identified group. So to sum that all up, oppression equals discrimination plus power. And power would be another key term there. So if we're using our same example, okay, if we bring it all the way back to stereotype, we said all poor people are lazy. Then we built that up with a prejudice. All poor people are lazy, so I think less of them. Then we built it to discrimination. All poor people are lazy, I think less of them, so I will not invite them out with me. And now we're using oppression. So let's say I am the boss of a business. I have power, right? I'm the boss. I have the power there in that business. I think less of poor people, right? Because they're lazy. So when I have a job opening, I will require people who are applying for that job to disclose what their previous salaries were. And I'm going to take that into consideration when I hire someone. So let's say I have job applicant A. Job applicant A, they made $30,000 at their last job, and job applicant B, they made $70,000 at their last job. When I see applicant A who made $30,000, I'm going to say to myself, ooh, that's a low wage. That makes them poor. And if they're poor, they're lazy. Do I want a lazy person working for my company, for my business? And I see applicant B who made $70,000. Oh, that's a good wage. They must be motivated. They must be dedicated, right? So I'm going to think more of them, and I'm going to take their previous salaries into consideration when I go to hire. Looking back at this definition of oppression, it says a system of structured inequality. So that next slide, we're going to talk about what is a system, or I'll refer to it as an institution. What is a system? What is an institution? What do I mean by that? So I'll answer that on the next slide. Another key part to focus in on is it is available to some individuals, these services, these rewards, these privileges, these benefits. And we'll also touch on that later on in the presentation. But right now we're talking about those things that are not available to others, and that would be the oppressed group, okay? So after this next slide, I will take a pause for you all to ask any questions or comments. But when I say a system of structured inequality, right, those systems, those institutions, here are a few that I can name. Government would be an example of an institution. The criminal justice system, that is an institution. Corporations, healthcare system, banking institutions, education, military, and media. These would be examples of systems or institutions that we're talking about when it comes to oppression. That they have social and cultural power to oppress groups of people. one point that I want to make is that society, when we think about oppression, society has been reorganized this way, right? Our society didn't start out this way, but it has been reorganized this way. The good part there is we can reorganize our society. Folks do not have to experience oppression, okay? These oppressed groups are experiencing violence, exploitation, powerlessness, but it doesn't have to be like that. And we'll touch on that further in a later slide. But what I want to do is take a pause. I want to see if you all have any questions, comments, see what you all are thinking or feeling at this point in the presentation. And if you have a question or comment, you can post it in the chat box, or if you would like to share, you can raise your hand and then Anesra can unmute you and you can share that with the group.
All right, so we do have a couple of comments. First comment, someone said, good so far. Next comment is, this is such a clear way to explain the foundations of oppression.
Well, I'm glad that it's been clear so far, because this really is an introduction to a privilege and oppression. And we could do a lot more webinars and presentations about, you know, privilege and oppression and really hone in on some of these. But I'm glad that this is all clicking so far.
I mean, it doesn't look like we have any more questions.
Awesome. So I'm gonna keep moving on.
I'll pop in for one more quick thing. In your presentation on the pay differences, and I see education here, I know that universities, certainly in the 90s, inflated their cost in order to make them seem more valuable. And when you were talking about the two candidates, I was wondering about that, because certainly if I can get somebody, if I'm an employer and I can get somebody for much less, that would seem to be something that I would be looking for, unless there's some other difference that gives that additional value or the appearance of that additional value. You know, see if there's any feedback on that, just curious.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, you're touching on capitalism, which touches on all of these different forms of oppression. So the answer won't be in this presentation, but I appreciate you bringing up that question. And I think it'd be worth chatting offline to answer that question. So thank you for that.
Thank you for doing that. I just thought people may want to talk rather than type. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. All right, so what I'm gonna do now is move on to our next slide, which is we're going to briefly define different forms of oppression. I have some listed here on the PowerPoint. This is not an end-all be-all, but this is meant to be a starter for this conversation. And it will also help us in our activity, which will be the cage of oppression at the end of this presentation. So we're gonna go ahead and define these terms to the best of our knowledge. And again, we could have a webinar on each one of these and all the others that are not listed here. But what I want you to do is to look at these different terms. So we've got racism, sexism, heterosexism, classism, and ableism. These are various forms of oppression. I want you to ask yourself, racism, so we'll start with racism, that would be the oppression of a group of people based on what? So when we talk about racism, people are being oppressed based on what? And I want you to go ahead and submit your answer via the chat box. So a good example would be like the YWCA mission. Part of it is, the first part is to eliminate racism. When we're talking about eliminating racism, what are we talking about? We're trying to help folks based off of what?
All right, so we have an answer, race.
Yeah, good. So racism would be the oppression of a group of people based on their race, okay? And we'll define that a little bit further later on. Let's move on to the next one, sexism. Sexism is the oppression of a group of people based on what?
We have an answer and gender.
Good. So sexism would be the oppression of a group of people based off of their sex. And so when we say sex, we're talking about biology, but there is also oppression based off of someone's gender, and that would be cisgenderism. And we could have a whole nother presentation on that. But briefly, the difference between sex and gender is sex would be, let's say a baby is born, the doctor looks down and says that is a female or that is a male, or they are intersex, right? Versus what gender would be is, how do you present yourself in the world? What pronouns do you use? So I said my pronouns are she and they. So that'll give you an insight on my gender. What kind of clothes do you wear? You know, haircuts can be an insight on someone's gender. So a gender is really thinking about someone's presentation and how they navigate that world. But sex would be different than that. Let's look at heterosexism. So heterosexism is the oppression of a group of people based on what? So you're seeing there's sexism in there, and we just said that was sex. So what would be heterosexism?
All right, so we have sexual identity.
Good. So heterosexism would be the oppression of a group of people based on their sexual orientation. So who you are romantically or sexually attracted to. And then let's go to the next one, classism. That would be the oppression of a group of people based on what?
Wealth, education, occupation, religion, etc.
Yeah, classism is definitely multi-layered. So socioeconomic status, which plays a part into someone's education.
I'm sorry, that was region I meant to put down.
Oh, region.
But
Okay.
religion also falls into that, but I was thinking
Yeah.
more region. That is, coming from Southern Indiana and talking to people from Chicago or talking to people from New York, there is a very different opinion of people from different parts of the country about different people from different parts of the country, about their class or lack of it.
Absolutely. And we've got one more, which would be ableism. So the oppression of a group of people based on what? So ableism, we are oppressing a group of people based on their what?
We have abilities.
Yep. And so when we talk about ability, I think most oftentimes folks think physical abilities, but it's even broader than that, right? We think about mental health concerns, you think about physical abilities and so on. So nice work, everybody. As I mentioned before, there are a lot more isms that we could name and define, but we're just gonna focus on these ones now to help us with our activity later on. So we have been focusing on oppressed groups or marginalized groups. And we said that those are folks who don't have access, who have barriers, who are not given the same benefits, privileges that, as we see here, would be the opposite, would be privileged groups of people. So if someone is being marginalized, that means that someone else is benefiting from them losing, right? From them not having access to or not being able to obtain whatever services are in question. So let's talk about privilege. When we talk about privilege, we are talking about choices, entitlements, advantages, benefits, assumptions, and expectations that are granted based on membership in the culturally dominant group. So again, I'm gonna read that one more time, take that all in. But privilege is choices, entitlements, advantages, benefits, assumptions, and expectations that are granted based on membership in the culturally dominant group. I had mentioned at the beginning that we're talking about the US society, right? We see privilege and oppression throughout the world. But when we're having this conversation here right now, we are talking about the US and thinking about what would be the culturally dominant groups here. If you can see below, there is an image of students sitting in their desk in a classroom. And in front of them is a recycle bin. Each student is given a crumpled up piece of paper, and their goal as a student is to shoot the paper into the recycling bin. Now there are 4 rows of students. So when we think about privilege and oppression, thinking about that first row of students, do they have any students in front of them? No, right? So that would be a privileged group, right? There are no barriers. There's nothing, there's not too much to stop them from easily making a basket into the recycling bin. Versus if we think about the students who are in the last row, they have 3 rows of students ahead of them. And then they also have some space to try to make it into the recycling bin, right? And that would be the oppressed or the marginalized group. So we can see how this is an example of, I mean, one way to explain privilege and oppression, right? Sometimes when I talk about privilege, people get defensive, right? They realize that they have some privilege. And what I would say back to that is, it is not a bad thing that you have privilege, right? I wish everybody had that same level of privilege. The issue comes with, what are you doing with your privilege? Are you using your privilege to shut people out? Or are you using your privilege to, and we'll talk about this a little later, break down this cage of oppression? Are you using your privilege to uplift, to help other people out, to help the oppressed and marginalized groups out? When I talk about privilege, sometimes I hear comments of, well, I didn't start this system. It's not my fault that I have privilege. No, it's not your fault, right? It's also not my fault that I'm experiencing oppression. The issue is, we inherited this system of privilege and of oppression. So what are we going to do about it? We didn't create it, but we are still benefiting or being hurt by the system. So what we need to do is we need to accept responsibility for its continued existence. And we need to accept responsibility and to take ownership of its continued existence, and we need to break down this cage of oppression. And one more thing before I stop for a break for questions or comments is this slide here. People without institutional or cultural power cannot, and I stress, cannot oppress. When we define privilege, we said people with privilege have institutional and cultural power. Okay, so let me give you an example. If I, as a Black person, could I stereotype white people, right? So when we think about racism, the oppressed group would be Black people or people of color, and the privileged group would be white folks, right? So could I, as a Black person, stereotype? Could I make a judgment about white people? Sure. Could I, as a Black person, be prejudiced towards white people? Sure. Could I, though, as a Black person, oppress white people? And the answer there would be no. So I'm going to give it to you all. Why is the answer no? Why could the oppressed group, or why could the marginalized group not oppress the privileged group? And again, we're focusing on oppression.
Okay, someone says the privileged group has more power.
Yeah, and that's the key piece when it comes to oppression, is power is that main piece, right? So, and when we think about power, we're talking about who is in control of those institutions. So remember, we listed out some of the institutions, government or education or healthcare or banking or government. Who are the people in power there? Who have been the people in power there? Those are the people with the institutional power, okay? When we think about cultural power, we're talking about who sets the cultural or societal norms. Again, in this case, it would be white folks, right? So if you are a person of color, you could not oppress because they lack that institutional or cultural power. Good.
And we do have someone that says that they disagree with that.
Absolutely. So we've got a limited time block here, but at the end of this presentation, I will have my contact information and would encourage that person to reach out, and we could have a one-on-one conversation if that's something that they wanted to. Are there any other questions or comments before we move into, I've got one more slide and then we're gonna move into our activity.
I do not see anything posted at this moment. I disagree, refer to the terror.
Yeah, so I'll just put out the same response that that's something that we can chat offline with, but absolutely, thank you for bringing that up. So before we get into our activity, I wanted to talk about this term called intersectionality. And some of you may be familiar or not be familiar with this term, but when we talk about intersectionality, this is a term that was coined by Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw. And she defined it as an overlapping or intersecting social identities and related systems of oppression, domination, and discrimination. So as you look at the image, it shows different identities that we as people hold. So we think about our gender, our race, our age, our religion, our class, and so forth. I want us to pause and look at the titles that we have here and think about, what are our identities? So when we say gender, what is your gender? What is your race? What is your age, religion, class? So just take a moment to reflect on that to yourself. Okay, y'all can hear me now? All right, so now that you've reflected on what your social and cultural identities that you hold, we as human beings are not simple, right? We hold many identities, and it can be conflicting, it can be complex, right? So thinking about our definitions of privilege and oppression, we can be experiencing both of those things at one time. So an example would be when I look at race, I am a person of color. And in that sense, I experience oppression and being marginalized because I am a person of color. At the same time, I also have a bachelor's degree. That is a privilege, right? That affords me different benefits and different things that I would not have without that degree, right? So on one hand, I'm experiencing oppression, and on the other hand, I'm experiencing privilege. Thinking about language, right? English is my first language. And in the United States, that benefits me with privilege, right? But again, thinking about sexuality, I am a lesbian, and that would put me in the oppressed group. So me as Cinnamon, okay, I have a complex understanding of my identities, and I have a lot of intersection between experiencing privilege and oppression. I imagine that most of you all have that too, right? You're not just all on one side or all on the other side, but you have a little bit of both. Okay, so it's important that we recognize when we're talking about privilege and oppression, it's not just a simple a straightforward thing, but that we can have some overlap there. And Ezra, were there some questions?
Yes, so we do have a couple comments. So one is, there is an assumption of oppression, the need for a victim or villain.
It is not an assumption of oppression. It exists. It is real. And again, it's not the villain, right? When we talk about an oppressor or the privileged group, it's what are you all doing with that oppression? I mean, with that privilege, excuse me. So are you helping folks out, or are you trying to keep them shut? And we should all be at the same level, because as I mentioned before, our society does not have to be organized this way. There doesn't have to be two categories, right? We didn't create the system. It doesn't have to be this way, but it exists. It is the way that things are. So what are we gonna do to change that? What can we do to make sure that everybody does have a level playing field?
Okay. And that's all I had for you for right now.
So again, just think about where you fall here in terms of your identities. So what we'll do now is move into our activity for the cage of oppression. So here's our cage of oppression. And at the top row, so we've got 3 rows. Row number 1 has various forms of oppression laid out. Now, we're not going to go through every single one of them. We're just going to stick with the ones that we've identified. And the ones that we identified were ableism, heterosexism, classism, sexism, and racism. So that's row 1, are various forms of oppression. Row 2, we are going to identify who are the privileged groups of people there, right? So when we talk about ableism, who are the people that experience privilege? When we talk about heterosexism, who are the people that experience privilege there? And the third row will be the oppressed group. So when we think about ableism, again, who has experienced oppression or marginalization there? When we think about heterosexism, who is experiencing oppression there, okay? So we're gonna go through row 2, the privilege group, and then go through row 3. So I'm gonna ask you all, who is the privilege group for ableism? And I want you to go ahead and submit your thoughts on the chat box. Well, I kind of gave you all a hint, but.
So we have high intellect.
Good, because as we mentioned before, when we talk about ableism, it's not just physical, but it's also mental as well.
And then physically strong and healthy.
Good. So ableism, we're talking about able-bodied. That is the example that I wrote in here. How about heterosexism? So we said heterosexism is the oppression of people based off of their sexual orientation. So what group of people fits in the privileged group?
And we had an addition for ableism, emotionally healthy as well. So we have heterosexual.
Yep. So heterosexual, or, and I think more common terms is straight. Good. And then we have anti-Semitism here. Again, we're not going to go through all of these, but we have Christian, lookism. One example would be thin, ageism and adultism, middle age. But I'll ask for your feedback on classism. So who would be the group of folks that experience privilege when we think about class?
High level of education.
Yeah, good. So, you know, when I brought up the bachelor's degree, right, that allows me to move up in terms of class. So education fits under class. But yeah, the wealthy folks would fit in the privileged group for classism. How about sexism? So we said that is oppression based off of sex. Who is the group of people that would experience privilege here?
And we have males.
Good. Yes, that's the correct answer. Males would be the group of people who would fit here. And then last one is racism. What group of people experiences benefits based off of race?
All right, and we have another comment. In anti-Semitism, you left out Muslim and atheists.
Yeah, so that will actually fit in our third row there, and we'll touch on that. Thank you.
We have white, non-Hispanic.
Yep, good. So white folks would then fall into the category of the privileged group. So take a quick look. When we think about privileged groups, and again, there's more to be named, but we're talking about able-bodied, straight, Christian, thin, middle-aged, wealthy, men, and white folks, okay? Now let's move on to our third row, which is the group for oppressed groups or marginalized groups. So when we think about ableism, so oppression based off of ability, what group of folks fits there? Who is the group of people that are harmed by ableism? And you can post that in the chat box. So if it's not able-bodied, then what would be your opposite there? All right, I'm gonna throw y'all a bone. Y'all did such a good job on that second row.
Oh, we got a response. So people with disabilities.
Good. People with disabilities. Exactly what I wrote. Nice job. Heterosexism. So who is the group of people that are harmed by heterosexism? So we said straight people are the ones who experience the privilege. Who is experience the oppression?
People who are homosexual.
Yeah, so heterosexual versus homosexual, and those terms are pretty outdated, but we would say someone who is lesbian, gay, bisexual, pansexual, asexual would fit underneath this category. Good. Again, as I mentioned before, for anti-Semitism, Jewish folks, someone brought up folks who are Muslim, they would fall underneath this group, or who are atheists. With lookism, the opposite then of thin would be fat, and there's some other examples we can use there. Ageism and adultism, the oppressed group would be young, and when I say young, I mean children, and old, we're talking about older adults, senior citizens. Looking at classism, I just gave y'all the answer. Who would be the oppressed group here? So we said wealthy would be the privileged group, and then who would be the oppressed group? So if you're not rich, you are
Poor.
poor. There you go. All right. Sexism. What group of people falls under the oppressed group for sexism?
All right. We have women.
Yep. Women. Good. And then we talked about the difference between sex and gender, but for this conversation, I also threw up women and then folks who are transgender. And then we've got one last category, racism. What groups of people would fall under the oppressed group here?
People of color.
Nice job. So we've got people of color, and I named some of those folks. So Black folks, Asian people, Latino, Native or Indigenous people. Those would be the groups of people we're talking about when we talk about people of color. So again, take a second, just look at this cage of oppression, figure out where you fall within this cage. And while you're looking at it and reflecting, this cage is, and this activity is meant to show the structured inequality that we have here in the US. So when we're looking at that second row, the privileged group, we are looking at groups of people who are benefiting from this system, right? Just simply for existing. Those folks didn't create the system, but they still gain, they still have advantages and benefits simply for existing in that group. And below them, you have groups of people who are being denied their rights, who are being denied their benefits, and they're experiencing systemic disempowerment, right? So one group is gaining, but that also means that somebody is being hurt by this cage. And as I mentioned before, we don't have to have a system that looks like this, but this is what our society looks like. This is how our society and our institutions are structured. So what I want y'all to do is just take a moment to reflect on where you are but more specifically, what you can do with your privilege. Because I imagine folks on this webinar have at least one slot in a privileged group. So what can you do with your privilege to start to break down this cage of oppression? So I'll give you all a moment to reflect, and you can just reflect to yourself, or if you feel comfortable, you can post it in the chat box. But what can you do to start chipping away at this cage of oppression? Could be big, could be small, somewhere in between. And why don't we do this? Let's backtrack for a second. We can go through, so let's start with ableism. Let's think about, because I mentioned small steps that we can take. Let's start with ableism. What are some words that we as the US society uses to describe people with disabilities? And words that I'm looking for are words that are harmful, that demean people with disabilities. So these words will not be nice. They will be hurtful. And you can go ahead and post them in the chat box, but it's worth having a conversation over. What words do we use to describe people with disabilities? That's meant to keep them in this cage. It's meant to be harmful to them.
We do have a comment that came in. Every day I am moving to the old, so. And then a word for your question was crazy. Another one is, where do trans ableists? Where do trans ableists fit?
Awesome. So yeah, someone mentioned crazy. That would absolutely be a term that we use to describe folks with disability, and especially folks who have some mental health concerns. And then the second comment about, you said trans?
Yep, trans ableist. Trans ableist.
Yeah, I mean, I would ask whoever commented that just to expand a little bit, because those would be two different things, right? So if we added a whole nother column there, it would be gender, right? Or cisgenderism would be our ism. And that top row would be cisgender, meaning your sex and gender align. And then the marginalized group would be transgender, so your sex and gender do not align. So that's one column. And then ableism would be a whole nother column, which we have already put here. And if someone who is transgender is also able-bodied or able mind, then you would just be experiencing privilege and oppression at the same time.
I'm assuming it's, are you familiar with term? That's the question. Are you familiar with term?
No, I've never heard of that term, so I will look it up. And I'll share my contact information at the end, and yeah, we can chat one-on-one after the call, but no, I have not heard of that term before. So yeah, we use crazy as one word to describe folks with disabilities. Let's move on to heterosexism. What would be some words that we use to describe lesbian, gay, bisexual folks that are harmful, that are meant to keep them in their box?
And then a response did come in. It's people identified as disabled.
Gotcha.
Okay, and then to answer your question, the response is sick.
Good. Yeah, I know growing up, people would use gay in the opposite way, right? So like, oh, that's so gay. Using gay to describe things that they found were uncool or that people shouldn't like. Good. Moving on to, how about classism? What words do we use to describe people who are poor?
Homeless.
Good. And when we use words like homeless to describe people, oftentimes we have a stereotype or a prejudice that comes along with that word, right? Good. We got two more. Sexism. So what words do we use to describe women that are meant to keep them in their place? Someone had mentioned crazy before, and oftentimes that word is also used with women. I know emotional is used as one of those words.
All right, someone just commented emotional.
Yeah.
Get that a lot.
Good. And one more, we'll do racism. So what words do we use to describe people of color to keep them in their place?
The old word was hysterical for women or for sexism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, hysterical, absolutely.
So for racism, thugs.
Yeah, good, because again, when we think about the word thugs, there's a stereotype or prejudice and image that's brought into our minds when we use that words or when we're trying to describe someone. Good. So I want y'all to just reflect for a second. why do these words exist? What purpose do these words serve? And I'll tell you why. And one of the reasons why it is to demean people, to devalue groups of people, to dehumanize people. And so when we start getting on that track and we start dehumanizing people, it's easier for us to, and it makes it seem like it's okay to exploit people, to use violence against different groups of people, right? And that's why we have all these different words made up.
We do have some responses.
Yeah, it's to other people and to make them seem different than, less than. Yeah, go ahead, Anestra.
Right. So the responses we have to perpetrate stereotypes, and then to justify that a group of people don't have as many privileges. And then we had a question, isn't that Indian, for, I'm assuming, something you said earlier.
Yeah, so Indian was used as a way to identify or, to identify like Native or Indigenous folks. But folks who are Indian and folks who are Native or Indigenous, yeah, those two groups of people are separate. Yeah.
We put the responses to thugs, isn't that Indian?
You say, isn't that Indian?
Yeah, so in response to thugs, isn't that Indian, like other than India? Like, so folks that aren't from India, I would assume.
Yeah, I mean, so the correct way to use Indian would be to describe folks who are from India, or who that's their cultural family, etc. But Indian has been used to describe Native folks and Indigenous folks, but those are two separate groups of people. So I had asked y'all a question to think about. What can you do with your privilege to try to to chip away at this bird cage? So go ahead and post some comments and thoughts in the chat box. What can you do with your privilege to end these different systems of oppression? And I can start with an example, which would be, as I work for Stepping Stones, the Rape Crisis Center for McLean County, I use my privilege in certain spaces to stand up or call out people who are making sexist jokes or making rape jokes, right? Having people explain, can you tell me why is that funny? Or just saying, hey, that's not okay to say, and here's why. Or, here's why you can't say those words or say those terms. So that's one way that I use my privilege.
So we have challenge people's stereotypes and stereotyping language.
Absolutely. Good. And it's all right if I don't want to share right now, but I definitely hope that you all take that from this conversation as thinking about and talking more with other folks. What can you do with your privilege? And how can we start to work towards dismantling these systems of oppression? Because they only continue to exist because people with privilege have decided to not take action, right? A collective group have decided to not take action. Why? Because it benefits them, right? But we could live in a society where everybody is experiencing those privileges. So what I want to do
Great.
is
We do have one more comment. We do have one more comment, Cinnamon. How to deal with internalized oppression.
Absolutely. And this journey with understanding privilege and understanding oppression is not one that happens overnight. This is a lifelong, continued journey. And that's where we start within ourselves, right? To identify what words do I use, right? Thinking about the words that we use and what kind of weight do they carry? Or thinking about when you see a group of people, what thought runs through your mind? And so we can start with ourselves and those things that we have internalized, and then move from there into conversation with our friends, our family members, and moving to our community, and then ultimately moving to a societal level, right? Thinking about policies and norm changes that we can all make. So I appreciate the person that shared that. And so what I'll do is I'm here with my contact information. So if y'all have more questions, if you're like, I knew this and I want some more education, or if you'd like for me to reach out to a group of people, please reach out to me. My email is cporter@ywcamclean.org. Again, if you have more questions or want to have some one-on-ones, please reach out to me. And I'll leave a minute or two here if people want to share any other questions or comments they have in the chat box. But if not, you all can reach me via email. And I do want to say I appreciate you all joining us on this webinar today. I hope you all got some information out of this. And again, this is meant to be a beginning point, and we can dive further with some additional webinars. So Vanessa, if you don't see any more questions, we can close it out for here. Again, my email is cporter@ywcamclean.org. And thank you all for hopping on this call.
Well, thank you very much. Let's see, did you have any of those questions you want to respond to now, or not? So there were some things you were going to get back to me later on, but thought that you may not have the time since we are now at 15 minutes after the end of the presentation.
Yeah, so if you just want to shoot me an email with the questions that you had, because I'm going to have to look back through this chat box here. Oh.
One of them that I had was the idea, going back to the TARE, that the